He just wanted to complete a difficult mountain route and climb to a place where almost no one goes. But at the top of the cliff, he saw several old abandoned cabins, and inside one of them, he found something that shocked him. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. He had always preferred mountains to people. Not out of bitterness or arrogance, but out of a simple, practical understanding of where he felt most at ease. In the city, everything required explanation. A glance, a tone, a gesture could be misread. Conversations demanded small lies and polite masks. In the mountains, nothing pretended to be anything other than what it was. Stone was stone, wind was wind. Effort was honest, and consequences were immediate. That clarity had drawn him back again and again until hiking stopped being a hobby and became a quiet necessity. He was not a professional climber, and he never claimed to be. Years of experience had made him careful rather than reckless. He knew his limits and respected them. What he valued most was the rhythm of long, difficult days on isolated trails, where every step depended only on his own decisions. The sense of control he lacked elsewhere in life seemed to settle naturally on his shoulders as soon as he tightened the straps of his backpack. This trip was meant to be no different. He had chosen a route that few people bothered with, a narrow line on an old map that branched away from the popular paths and climbed toward a section of cliffs rarely mentioned in guidebooks. The official trails were crowded this time of year, full of weekend hikers with bright new equipment and loud conversations. He wanted distance from all of that. Distance from the noise, from the predictable stories, from the comfort and safety of marked routes. Preparation had been slow and deliberate, the way he always prepared. The night before leaving, he spread his gear across the living room floor and went through it piece by piece. Sturdy boots already worn into the shape of his feet. Extra layers packed in waterproof bags. A small medical kit carefully checked. Enough food for 3 days, even though he planned to be out for only 2. A reliable flashlight, spare batteries, a paper map folded along familiar creases, and a compass he trusted more than any electronic device. He had learned long ago that mountains had little patience for people who relied entirely on technology. He studied the weather reports until he was satisfied. Clear skies in the morning, a possibility of wind higher up, a small chance of rain late on the second day. Nothing alarming. He marked potential water sources on his map and estimated how far he could reasonably travel before nightfall. Every decision felt calm and rational, like arranging pieces on a board whose rules he understood. At dawn, he drove out of the city while the streets were still half asleep. The highway slowly emptied, buildings gave way to fields, and eventually the familiar silhouettes of mountains appeared on the horizon. By the time he parked near the trailhead, the sun was just beginning to warm the cold air. A few other cars stood in the gravel lot, but their owners were already somewhere up the easier paths, chasing viewpoints and photographs. He adjusted his pack, took a long breath, and stepped onto the trail without looking back. The first hours passed comfortably. The path was clear and well-maintained, winding through tall trees and along gentle slopes. He crossed small streams, listened to the distant calls of birds, and felt his body settle into the steady pace he knew so well. Occasionally, he passed other hikers heading in the opposite direction, exchanging brief nods and polite smiles. Their presence reminded him that he was still within the safe, familiar world of designated routes. Gradually, almost without noticing, that world began to fade. The trail narrowed. The ground grew steeper and rockier. Painted markers on trees became rare and then disappeared entirely. At a fork in the path, he stopped and consulted his map, confirming the direction he intended to take. From that point on, the route was less a trail and more a suggestion left behind by people who had passed this way long ago. He welcomed the change. The air felt different once the signs of regular tourism vanished. There were no more voices drifting through the trees, no more bright backpacks bobbing ahead of him. Only the sound of his own breathing and the quiet crunch of boots on gravel. This was the kind of solitude he had come for. As the elevation increased, the forest thinned. Trees grew shorter and more twisted, clinging stubbornly to rocky soil. The wind became stronger, carrying with it the sharp scent of cold stone. Clouds moved quickly overhead, casting moving shadows across the landscape. He paused often to drink water and study the terrain, choosing his steps carefully. Every decision mattered a little more now. By early afternoon, he reached a stretch of ground where even the faintest trace of a path vanished completely. The map showed a rough direction rather than a clear line, and he followed it with cautious confidence. Scrambling over loose rocks, climbing narrow ledges, he felt the pleasant fatigue of muscles working hard and efficiently. Moments like these reminded him why he kept returning to difficult places. It was around that time that he noticed the first small oddity. High above the last line of trees, he found an old metal nail driven into a weathered piece of wood, half buried among stones. At first, he assumed it was nothing more than debris carried up by some long-ago traveler. But a little farther along, he spotted another sign of human presence, a faint mark on a boulder that looked suspiciously like the scar of an axe. The details were easy to dismiss individually, yet together they felt strangely out of place. He tried to imagine reasonable explanations. Perhaps hunters had once used this area. Maybe shepherds from decades past had climbed this high with their animals. Still, the higher he went, the more difficult those theories became to believe. This was not a convenient or welcoming part of the mountain. Survival up here would require real effort and determination. The climb grew more demanding as the day wore on. Several times he had to use his hands to pull himself up short sections of exposed rock. The wind howled through narrow passages, tugging at his jacket and testing his balance. Far below, the safer trails looked like thin ribbons crawling along the valley floor. From this height, the world seemed distant and insignificant. Despite the challenges, he felt calm. Years of experience had taught him to read his own limits. He moved carefully, taking short breaks, paying attention to the subtle signals of fatigue. The mountains had a way of punishing pride, and he had no desire to prove anything to anyone. Late in the afternoon, as he rounded the edge of a jagged cliff, he stopped suddenly. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The light was strange up here, bouncing off pale rock and shifting clouds. But when he focused again, the shapes remained exactly where they were. Ahead of him, built directly into a narrow stone ledge, stood several small wooden cabins. For a long moment, he simply stared, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The structures were old, their boards darkened by years of wind and weather. Roofs sagged slightly, and walls leaned in ways that suggested age and hardship. Yet they were undeniably real, unmistakably crafted by human hands. Their location made no logical sense. The ledge they occupied was high above any reasonable path, surrounded by sheer drops and unstable rock. Transporting materials to such a place would have been incredibly difficult. Living there would be even harder. No road could reach it. No easy trail led to its doorsteps. He felt a faint stir of unease mixed with curiosity. Abandoned huts were not unusual in remote regions, but these were different. They were not scattered shelters or temporary camps. They looked intentional, carefully positioned, as if someone had chosen this impossible location on purpose. From where he stood, he could see at least 3 of them, clustered together like stubborn survivors refusing to surrender to the elements. The sight was both fascinating and unsettling. Nothing about the scene fit the normal logic of mountain life. He checked the time. There were still a few hours of daylight left. Part of him considered turning back, leaving the mystery untouched and continuing with his original plan. But another part, the part that had always pushed him toward difficult routes and unanswered questions, refused to let him walk away. Approaching carefully, he searched for the safest way across the exposed rock. The final stretch required slow, deliberate movement, testing each foothold before trusting his weight to it. Whoever had once lived here must have mastered this dangerous approach. That realization alone made him more cautious. As he drew closer, more details became visible. The cabins were small but solidly built. Doors hung slightly crooked on old hinges. Tiny windows stared out over the vast emptiness below. There were no signs of recent activity. No smoke stains, no footprints, no fresh marks on the ground. Yet the place did not feel completely forgotten either. He paused at the edge of the ledge, listening to the wind whistle between the rocks. The silence around the cabins was heavy, almost deliberate, as if the mountain itself were keeping some secret. Standing there, alone on that high and lonely cliff, he felt the first real hint that his carefully planned journey had quietly shifted into something very different. What he had expected to be just another challenging hike was turning into a question with no obvious answer. And he was already too curious to turn away from it. For several minutes, he stayed where he was, balanced on a patch of uneven rock, letting his eyes move slowly across the ledge and the cabins, as if staring long enough might rearrange them into something reasonable. The wind pressed and released in pulses, tugging at his jacket and whispering along the cliff face. Far below, the valley looked softened by distance, almost peaceful, as though it belonged to another world that had never heard of such a place. He had seen remote shelters before. He had come across the remains of a shepherd's hut collapsed into grass, and once, years earlier, he had found a half-rotten hunting shack in a ravine that barely appeared on the map. But those were where human logic tended to put them, in places reachable by tired legs and simple necessity. These cabins were different. They were not tucked into a hollow or hidden behind trees. They were perched on a narrow shelf of stone, exposed to weather, so high and so inconvenient that the act of building them seemed like a stubborn argument against common sense. He forced himself to stop staring and start observing the way he did when he was uncertain about a route. He lowered his breathing, steadied his stance, and began to study the structures from a distance as if they were part of the terrain. The first thing he noticed was placement. Whoever had chosen this ledge had chosen it with intelligence. The cabins were set slightly back from the sheer edge, where the wind would be less direct, and angled so that snow sliding off the roofs would spill outward rather than pile against the doors. They were not arranged randomly. The cluster had a purpose, a pattern that suggested someone had lived here long enough to learn what the mountain did in different seasons. The second thing he noticed was the wood itself. It was dark, almost black in places, and polished by years of weather. Some boards were warped but not split. That meant maintenance. That meant repair. A truly abandoned cabin left to the mountain would be eaten quickly. Here, the walls still held their shape. The roofs sagged, yes, but they had not collapsed. The doors were crooked, but they remained attached, and someone had reinforced them at some point with additional planks and metal straps. These were not ruins from a century ago. These looked old, but not ancient. He felt the first real edge of unease creep into his chest, not as panic, but as a sober calculation. He was alone. The approach to the ledge was narrow and exposed. If someone were here now, he would have little room to run and fewer places to hide. Yet, the silence did not feel like the silence of presence. It felt like the silence of distance, of a place too forgotten for sound to have any business surviving in it. He shifted his weight and took a careful step forward, then another, testing the rock beneath his boots. The ledge did not begin as a flat platform. It was a rough, slanted strip of stone with shallow cracks and uneven bulges that forced him to move slowly. The cliff face to his left rose like a wall. To his right, open air fell away into nothing. He kept his eyes on the rock in front of him and his hands ready to catch himself if a foot slipped. As he advanced, he began to notice small signs that were not part of the cabins themselves, but part of the approach. Near a narrow gap in the rock, he saw a line of stones stacked in a way that did not look natural. They were not a cairn marking a trail for tourists, too low and too careful for that. They looked like something placed quietly, perhaps to indicate where to step when snow covered everything else. A few yards farther, he found an old metal ring embedded in the stone, half rusted, as though it had once held a rope. The ring was worn smooth where friction had worked it for years. Someone had used it repeatedly. Someone had climbed here often enough to leave a trace in iron. He stopped again, turning his head slowly, scanning the ledge, the doors, the shadows beneath the roofs. His instincts urged him to back away and return to safer ground while he still had daylight and strength. But another instinct, the one that had kept him alive in mountains for years, urged him to understand what he was dealing with before moving blindly away. If these cabins belonged to something dangerous, ignoring them would not make them less dangerous. If they belonged to someone lost, or desperate, or hiding, he might be standing near the only evidence of a life that could still matter. He told himself firmly that he would not do anything foolish. He would not step into a cabin if he sensed immediate risk. He would not linger if the weather shifted. He would approach, observe, and then decide. That was the kind of reasoning he trusted. The first cabin stood closest to him, its front wall facing the open valley. Its door was closed. The second cabin sat slightly higher, almost tucked into the curve of the cliff, where the rock offered a little protection. The third was farther back, partly obscured by a jutting section of stone. From this closer distance, he could see that the windows were small and reinforced. Not glass, but thick panes or shutters, built to withstand wind and perhaps to keep light from spilling outward at night. He reached the edge of the small clearing between the cabins and paused. The ground underfoot was not soil, but a mix of stone and compacted dust scattered with tiny fragments of wood. He crouched and brushed his fingers along the surface. It felt packed down in places, smoother than the surrounding rock, as if feet had traveled the same short path again and again. He looked for footprints and found none that were clear, nothing fresh enough to read, but the worn texture told its own story. This place had been lived in, not merely visited. He straightened, listening again. Only wind. No creak of boards from inside, no shifting sound behind a wall. Still, he did not move directly to the nearest door. Instead, he walked slowly around the cabin, keeping a careful distance, looking for anything that would explain how the structure had been made and maintained. Along the side wall he found more reinforcement, wooden beams braced against the rock. In one corner, someone had wedged stone between the cabin's foundation and a crack in the cliff, a crude but effective way of keeping the building stable. A person without patience would not do that. A person without long-term intention would not do that. A few feet from the rear wall, he noticed something else. A small scatter of ash, not fresh, but not ancient either. He leaned closer, watching the wind lift a faint gray dust. It might have been old, left from years ago, but the pattern was too neat, too contained. Whoever had made a fire here had done it carefully, as if even smoke was a risk. That thought returned him to the same uncomfortable question. Who would choose to live like this, where warmth was a danger and visibility was a threat? He approached the door of the first cabin and rested his hand lightly on the wood. It was rough, cold, and dry. He hesitated, then pushed gently. The door did not open. He tried again a little more firmly. It remained shut. Either it was swollen and stuck from weather, or it was secured from inside. The second possibility made his pulse tighten. He stepped back and looked at the hinges, then the frame. No obvious lock. No chain. Yet the door held. He moved to the second cabin, the one tucked closer to the cliff. Its door was slightly ajar, only a thin, dark line visible between the frame and the wood. He stood there, breathing, his senses sharpening as if his body was preparing for something it could not name. He pushed the door open slowly. The sound was quiet, just a soft scrape of wood and hinge, but in the vast stillness it felt loud. He held his breath for a moment, waiting for any response. Nothing came. The darkness inside remained still. He leaned forward, letting his eyes adjust, and then stepped over the threshold. The first impression was not of decay, but of deliberate simplicity. The cabin was small, the air inside dry and faintly scented with old smoke and timber. Light entered through a narrow window, painting a pale rectangle across the floor. The furniture was minimal. A narrow bed frame made from rough boards sat against one wall with what looked like a folded blanket or bedding, faded and worn. A small table stood near the window. In one corner, an iron stove rose like a black silhouette, its surface dulled by years of use. The second impression was order. There were no scattered belongings, no broken glass, no casual trash. An abandoned cabin usually told a story of neglect. This cabin told a story of discipline. Even the empty tins near the stove had been gathered in one place, not flung around. A few tools hung from nails in the wall, arranged by size. A coil of rope lay folded, not tangled. Someone had lived here with the habits of a person who knew that one misplaced item could cost time, and time could cost life. He moved slowly, careful where he placed his feet. The floorboards creaked in places, but not dangerously. He glanced at the stove and saw that the ash inside was old, but again, the cabin did not feel as though it had been left to rot. The wood was weathered, yes, but strong. The roof beams held. No damp smell, no mold. This was a place maintained by hands that understood survival. He set his backpack down near the door, partly to lighten himself, partly because it was what he did when he needed his balance and his thoughts clear. Then he began to examine the details more closely, as he had examined the approach outside. Near the bed, he noticed two sets of marks on the floor, worn grooves where boots had repeatedly landed. One set was larger, deeper. The other was smaller, lighter. Not definitive, but enough to suggest more than one person. On the table, the scratches formed patterns, as if someone had used it for writing, pressing hard against the wood. He walked to the window and looked out. From this angle, the valley below was visible in a broad sweep. He could see the faint line of a popular trail far beneath, where hikers moved like tiny dots. It was a perfect vantage point, not for beauty, but for watching. That thought landed heavily in his mind. Whoever had built these cabins had chosen a place that allowed them to see without being seen. He turned away from the window and continued his slow survey. Near the stove, he found a small shelf with a few items: a worn tin cup, a cracked bowl, a folded piece of cloth. Ordinary things, yet the way they were placed, the fact that they had not been knocked over or taken, suggested that whoever used them had intended to return, or had been forced to leave in a hurry. But there were no obvious signs of panic, no overturned chair, no torn fabric. The cabin felt like someone had closed it carefully and walked away. The question of time began to press at him. How long ago? A year? 5 years? More? The wood could look like this after decades at high altitude, but the order inside, the lack of rot, felt more recent. He listened again and heard only wind. His eyes drifted to the wall behind the stove. A section of boards there looked slightly different, darker, as if it had been handled more. He stepped closer. The seam between two boards was thin, nearly invisible, but it caught the light in a way that made him pause. He ran his fingers along it and felt a slight give. Not a loose board from decay, but something that had been fitted to move. He hesitated. Every rational part of him argued that he should stop. That curiosity in isolated places led to mistakes. Yet he also knew that whatever was here had already pulled him into its orbit. If there was something hidden, it was hidden for a reason, and understanding that reason might be the difference between simply leaving and leaving safely. He pressed gently, and the board shifted, sliding a fraction inward. He found the edge and eased it aside. Behind it, carved into the narrow space between wall and rock, was a small compartment, sealed from damp by cloth and what looked like an old waterproof wrap. Inside the compartment lay a thick book. It was not a paperback guide or a tourist journal. It was heavy, bound in dark leather, the surface cracked and worn, as if it had been carried, handled, protected. He lifted it carefully, surprised by the weight. For a moment, he simply held it, feeling the solidity of it in his hands, as though it was less an object and more a condensed piece of someone's life. He carried it to the table and set it down. The leather cover had no title, no name, only faint impressions where something might once have been stamped. He opened it slowly. The first pages were filled with neat writing, tight and disciplined. Dates, weather observations, wind direction, temperature estimates, notes about snowpack and visibility, everything recorded in a style that reminded him of field notes, the kind written by someone who treated nature with respect and did not romanticize it. The handwriting was steady. There was no wasted space. It was the writing of a person who had learned to conserve everything, even ink. He read further, and the notes expanded. References to trails below, not by their official names, but by landmarks and angles. Mentions of movement in the valley, times when groups passed. The writing remained calm, even when it described storms or unstable slopes. It was a record, not a story. Then, on a later page, he saw the first name. It was written plainly, without explanation, followed by a brief description and a time. Another name followed on the next page, and another. Some were paired, indicating couples. Some described a lone hiker. Some marked groups. There were details about clothing, pack size, speed, whether someone seemed tired, whether they hesitated at a dangerous section. It was unsettling, not because it sounded like predation, but because it sounded like attention. It sounded like someone had been watching human beings with the same careful precision used to watch weather. He turned the pages slowly, his fingertips grazing the paper as if he might damage it. The journal continued with the same quiet thoroughness. The more he read, the more his unease shifted into something deeper. Not fear exactly, something like the sensation of walking into a room after an argument has happened, where the air still holds the shape of it. As the days and months passed in the writing, he began to notice small marks. Symbols, perhaps, or shorthand. A circle beside one entry, a line drawn through another. In some places, brief notations appeared that were not about weather or movement. A few words added in the margin. A mention of leaving a sign. A reference to moving stones near a pass. The tone remained controlled, yet the act described was different. It suggested not just observation, but intervention. He kept reading, and the pages began to take on weight. He could feel, in the way the handwriting tightened and loosened across the seasons, the passage of time. Then he reached a page where a single phrase appeared beside a name. The words were simple, colder than anything else in the book. Did not return. He stared at it and then read it again, as if the meaning might shift. It did not. He flipped forward and saw another entry marked similarly. A few pages later, the phrase appeared again, this time followed by another word written in smaller, heavier strokes. Confirmed. He did not know what confirmed meant here. Confirmed by whom? Confirmed how? But the finality of it landed in his chest with a dull impact. This was no longer just a weather log. This was a record of lives seen from a distance, and of some lives that vanished. He sat down slowly, the bench beneath him creaking, the journal open on the table like a wound. Outside the small window, the world continued in bright silence. The valley did not change. The hikers below moved on, unaware that above them in a cabin hammered into rock, someone had once watched and written their names. His thoughts raced through explanations. A ranger, a rescuer, a hermit with an obsession, someone hiding from the law, someone with a reason to keep track of people without being seen. Each possibility carried its own kind of threat. He looked again around the cabin, noticing new details now that the journal had altered the meaning of everything. The reinforced windows, the careful seal of the door, the ash hidden, not displayed. The shelf with supplies arranged as if someone could not afford to waste a single second searching. Nothing here was romantic. Everything was practical. He turned another page and found more notes about intervention, a mention of placing water in a sheltered spot, a reference to guiding someone away from an unstable section, small actions described in the same unemotional tone as wind direction. The fact that they were written at all suggested they mattered deeply, yet the writer refused to indulge in explanation. The deeper he went, the more he felt the presence of a system. This was not the scattered scribbling of a lone eccentric. The consistency of dates, the disciplined observations, the repeated references to we in subtle places hinted at more than one person. The cabins outside were not a coincidence. They were part of something larger, something organized enough to endure for years. He closed the journal for a moment and rubbed his hands against his thighs, trying to anchor himself. His first instinct was to leave, to shut the door, walk away, and let the mountain keep its secrets. But he knew, with the same certainty that kept him safe on dangerous ridges, that he had already crossed a line. He had touched the hidden compartment. He had opened the book. He now carried knowledge that could not be unseen. And knowledge in the mountains was never neutral. It either helped you live, or it distracted you until you died. He looked at the journal again, and his eyes fell on the recentness of the later pages. The ink did not look bright, but the paper was not as yellowed as he expected. He could not date it precisely, but something about it felt nearer than it should. The thought made him cold. He stood and moved to the door, peering outside. The ledge remained empty. The other cabins stood silent, their dark wood absorbing the thin light. No movement, no smoke, no sign of anyone watching him now. Yet the feeling that someone might have chosen this place to remain unseen settled around him like the wind itself, invisible but constant. He returned to the table and opened the journal again, as if he could find an answer hidden in the next page. His eyes moved over another season of entries, and he realized that he had reached the point where observation was no longer enough. The journal was drawing him forward, toward understanding not just what these cabins were, but why they existed in the first place. Outside, the daylight had shifted. The sun lowered and the shadows lengthened across the floor. He felt time tightening. If he stayed too long, he would risk descending in darkness, which was its own kind of danger. Yet, he could not bring himself to close the book and walk away with nothing but questions. Carefully, he shut the journal and slid it back toward the hidden compartment. He did not yet know what he would do with it, but he knew he could not simply leave it on the table, exposed. Before returning it, he paused once more, his gaze fixed on the worn leather cover. Somewhere in those pages, someone had tried to hold the world in order by writing it down. Someone had tried to make sense of storms and human error, of life and disappearance. From a cliff high above everything, he placed the journal back into its hiding place and returned the board, pressing it until it fit seamlessly again. The cabin looked unchanged, as if it had never revealed anything to him. He picked up his pack, slung it over his shoulders, and stepped outside. The air was colder now, the wind sharper. He stood between the cabins and looked at them again, not as strange objects on a cliff, but as evidence of a deliberate choice. Whoever had lived here had done so with intention. Whoever had written that journal had watched human beings with enough care to remember their names, and with enough burden to mark some of them as never returning. He knew, as he began to move slowly toward the next cabin, that he was no longer just a hiker who had stumbled upon an odd sight. He was a witness to something unfinished, and whatever explanation existed for these cabins, it waited somewhere deeper within them, pressed into the wood and stone, held back for those reckless or responsible enough to look. He stepped out of the first cabin with the journal's weight still lingering in his thoughts, even though it now rested once again behind its hidden board. The discovery had changed the air around him. What had begun as a curious interruption in his route had slowly turned into something more serious, something that required attention rather than mere fascination. The ledge no longer felt like an odd ruin forgotten by time. It felt like a place that had been deliberately constructed for reasons he was only beginning to understand. Standing between the cabins, he allowed himself a long breath and forced his mind back to practical matters. The light was slowly shifting toward evening, and he needed to decide what he would do next. Turning back immediately would be the safest option. He could descend before the temperature dropped too far and be back on familiar ground by nightfall. Yet, he knew he would never forgive himself if he left without understanding more. Whatever story existed here did not belong to him, but he had already become part of it simply by opening that hidden compartment. He moved toward the second cabin, the one positioned closer to the curve of the cliff. The door hung slightly open, and as he approached he noticed that its hinges were newer than those on the first structure, replaced at some point with stronger metal. That detail alone told him something important. Maintenance. Care. These buildings had not been abandoned carelessly. Someone had invested time and effort to keep them standing. Pushing the door wider, he entered slowly, allowing his eyes to adjust once more to the dim interior. This cabin was arranged differently from the first. The space was narrower, with shelves built along one wall and a workbench beneath the window. Tools lay neatly across the surface, not scattered as in a forgotten shed, but placed with the precision of a workshop. He saw a hammer worn smooth at the handle, a small saw, lengths of rope coiled with careful discipline, and a collection of nails sorted by size in small tin containers. He ran his fingers along the edge of the bench and felt grooves where years of work had left their marks. Someone had repaired boots here, mended clothing, sharpened blades. The air smelled faintly of oil and wood dust rather than smoke. This was not a living space, he realized. It was a functional room, a place dedicated entirely to keeping the rest of the cabins operational. Against the far wall stood a small cabinet, its door closed with a simple latch. Inside, he found more practical supplies, spare lengths of wire, a few rusted hinges waiting to be reused, rolls of cloth, and a small box containing needles and thread. Nothing expensive, nothing luxurious. Only the bare essentials required to survive in a harsh environment without access to outside help. What struck him most was the sense of organization. Even after who knew how many years, the tools had not been abandoned in chaos. They were arranged as if the person who last used them had expected to return the next day. The thought made him pause. Abandonment usually left a certain kind of mess behind. Here there was no such disorder. Everything suggested an intentional departure rather than a gradual fading away. He walked to the small window and looked out again toward the valley. From this cabin, the view was slightly different, angled more toward a specific section of trail that twisted between two rocky outcrops. It occurred to him that each structure had been placed to observe a different approach. The realization added another layer to his understanding. Whoever had lived here had planned their vantage points carefully, choosing where to watch the world below with quiet precision. On a low shelf, he noticed a few personal items. A metal cup with a dented rim, a folded scarf faded almost to gray, a pair of gloves patched so many times that the original fabric was barely visible. These things felt more intimate than the tools, small traces of real human presence. He imagined someone sitting on a stool in the evening, mending torn fabric while the wind rattled the walls, living a life reduced to necessities and routine. He found no second journal here, no hidden compartments. The cabin seemed dedicated solely to work, yet even without written records, it told its own story. The people who had occupied this ledge had not been careless wanderers. They had been practical, disciplined, and prepared to endure long seasons in isolation. Leaving the workshop cabin, he turned his attention to the third and final structure. This one stood farther back against the cliff, partly sheltered by a natural overhang. Its position gave it more protection from the elements, and he suspected it might have been the main living quarters. The door creaked when he opened it, a deeper sound than before, as though the wood itself was older. Inside, the space felt warmer, more lived in. Two narrow beds stood against opposite walls, each covered with rough blankets. A larger table occupied the center of the room, its surface scratched and worn. Above it hung a small shelf with a few battered books, their titles faded beyond recognition. For the first time, he felt as if he had stepped into a place where actual daily life had unfolded. He set his backpack down carefully and began to explore with the same quiet respect he might give to someone else's home. The beds told their own story. One was slightly larger, the other narrower. The blankets were folded neatly, not tossed aside. On a small hook near the door hung an old jacket, heavy and patched at the elbows. Beneath it, a pair of boots rested, their soles worn thin but still serviceable. This cabin, more than the others, carried the weight of human routine. He could imagine two people sharing this small room through long winters, speaking in low voices, listening to storms batter the walls, waking before dawn to check the skies and the distant trails. The thought made the place feel both comforting and unbearably lonely. On the central table he found a few more objects: a chipped plate, a candle burned almost to nothing, a simple tin container filled with dried herbs. There was no sign of luxury, no attempt to make the space beautiful. Everything served a purpose. Survival left little room for decoration. As he examined the room, he noticed subtle differences between the two sides. One bed had a small wooden box beside it containing neatly folded papers, though they appeared to be blank scraps rather than letters. The other had a length of rope coiled carefully beneath the mattress. These were not strangers sharing a shelter by chance. These were people who had divided their lives and possessions with quiet agreement. He wondered again who they had been. The journal in the first cabin suggested a system of observation and intervention, but it did not reveal the full identities of those involved. Here, in this room, he felt closer to them as individuals. They had slept here, eaten here, endured cold and fear and endless days of waiting. Whatever reasons had driven them to this impossible place, those reasons must have been powerful. Near the rear wall, he found a small stove similar to the one in the first cabin, though this one showed more signs of use. The metal was darker, the ashtray fuller. Someone had spent many nights feeding this stove with whatever fuel they could gather, fighting against the relentless cold that came with altitude. He imagined the effort required simply to stay alive through a long winter on this ledge, cut off from the world below. What puzzled him most was the absence of any personal records. No photographs, no letters, no items that might reveal names or past lives. It was as if the inhabitants had deliberately erased every trace of who they had once been. The journal remained the only link to their thoughts, and even that had been hidden carefully away. He sat down at the table for a moment, letting the quiet of the cabin settle around him. The wind outside had picked up, whistling through small gaps in the walls, yet inside there was a sense of protection, as though the structure still fulfilled its duty despite its age. He realized how much effort must have gone into keeping this place habitable. Every board, every nail, every patched blanket represented hours of labor carried out far from any help. His attention drifted back to the idea of rules. These cabins had not been thrown together haphazardly. They followed a certain logic. Tools in one building, observation in another, living quarters in the most sheltered spot. Whoever had designed this arrangement had thought carefully about efficiency and safety. It resembled a small outpost more than a random hideaway. He began to see the ledge as a kind of quiet fortress, not meant for defense against armies, but against exposure and discovery. The reinforced windows, the concealed compartments, the minimal smoke traces all pointed to people who valued secrecy as much as survival. That realization deepened his unease. Secrecy usually implied danger, either from the world or from something within. Rising from the table, he continued his examination. Beneath one of the beds, he discovered a small storage space containing additional supplies: dried food sealed in old containers, spare clothing folded with care, a few bottles of medicine long expired. These were practical reserves, meant to carry someone through difficult times. Again, he felt the presence of disciplined planning. In a corner near the door, he found a simple wooden rack holding several walking sticks. Each one was worn smooth at the grip, cut to different lengths. He imagined them being chosen depending on the season, the terrain, the task at hand. Even these humble objects spoke of long routines repeated year after year. The more he looked, the more he understood that this place had been designed not for comfort, but for endurance. Nothing here was accidental. The people who lived on this ledge had accepted a hard life and shaped their environment to meet it. They had built not a refuge from the mountain, but a way to exist within it. He left the third cabin reluctantly, feeling as though he were stepping out of someone else's memory. The evening light outside had grown softer, casting long shadows across the rock. Standing once again between the buildings, he tried to assemble everything he had seen into a coherent picture. 3 cabins, 3 purposes: observation, work, and living. Tools carefully maintained, supplies stored with foresight, no personal decorations, no evidence of violence or disorder. Only the journal, hidden away like a secret confession, hinting at years of watching and helping from a distance. The place no longer felt mysterious in a supernatural sense. Instead, it felt intensely human. Human in its practicality, its caution, its quiet determination to survive in a world that offered little mercy. Whoever had lived here had chosen isolation not as a romantic adventure, but as a necessity. Yet the journal remained the key. Without it, these cabins would have been nothing more than a strange historical curiosity. With it, they became part of a larger narrative, one that involved not only the unseen inhabitants of the ledge, but the many travelers who had passed unknowingly beneath their watchful eyes. He walked to the edge of the ledge and looked down again at the valley. Tiny figures moved along the distant trail, unaware that high above them someone had once tracked their progress, worried over their safety, and perhaps saved their lives without ever being thanked. The thought filled him with a complicated mixture of admiration and sorrow. As the wind tugged at his clothing, he considered what he should do next. He had learned enough to understand the basic function of this place, but not enough to know the full story. The cabins had answered some questions and raised many more. Why had these people chosen to hide rather than seek help openly? What had driven them to live in such hardship? And what had ultimately become of them? The answers, he suspected, lay not in the physical spaces, but in the words carefully recorded in that hidden journal. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the cabins were only the surface. The real truth waited within those pages, in the careful lines of handwriting that had watched strangers come and go for years. He knew he could not simply walk away now, not with so much left unexplained. The sensible part of him still warned against staying too long, against becoming too deeply involved in a story that was not his. But another part, the part that valued understanding above comfort, urged him forward. The light continued to fade as he stood there, torn between caution and curiosity. Finally, he made his decision. He would return to the first cabin and examine the journal more thoroughly before night forced him to leave. He would read as much as he could, not out of prying interest, but out of respect for whatever life had unfolded here. Turning back towards the door of the first structure, he felt a subtle shift inside himself. He had arrived on this ledge as an outsider who had stumbled upon something strange. Now, after seeing the traces of careful living and disciplined survival, he felt more like a reluctant witness. The cabins had revealed their practical secrets. What remained was the deeper story, written carefully and patiently by hands that had once worked these rooms. And as he stepped once more toward the hidden compartment and the waiting journal, he understood that the true heart of this place was not built from wood and nails, but from the quiet record of human lives lived out of sight. When he stepped back into the first cabin, the air inside felt different from before, heavier with meaning now that he had seen the other rooms and understood the deliberate order of the place. The simple walls, the narrow bed, the iron stove no longer appeared as random remnants of an abandoned shelter. They were pieces of a system, carefully designed and carefully maintained by people who had lived here with intention. The journal, hidden behind the loose board, was the center of that system, the silent heart around which everything else had turned. He set his backpack beside the door and sat again at the small table where he had first opened the book. Outside, the light was thinning, but there was still enough day left to read without a lamp. He pulled the board aside once more and lifted the heavy volume from its hiding place. The leather felt cool and worn beneath his fingers, softened by years of handling. For a moment, he only looked at it, aware that what he was about to do would pull him deeper into a story he could no longer escape. Opening to the first pages again, he began to read with greater attention than before. Now that he understood something of the lives lived in these cabins, the early entries took on new clarity. The structure of the journal was precise and almost clinical. Dates were written at the top of each page, followed by short notes about weather conditions, visibility, and wind. The handwriting was consistent and steady, showing no hurry and no wasted emotion. Whoever had written these lines had treated the act as a daily duty rather than a personal diary. As he turned the pages, he noticed how carefully organized everything was. Certain symbols appeared repeatedly, marking types of weather or levels of risk. There were small drawings of arrows to show the direction of storms, tiny sketches of clouds, and simple marks to indicate snowfall. It was less a narrative and more a logbook, the kind of record kept by someone who believed that accurate observation could save lives. The first several months contained nothing but these environmental details. No names, no stories, only the slow rhythm of seasons passing high above the valley. Yet, even in those dry entries, he sensed purpose. These people had not chosen this place merely to hide. They had chosen it to watch. Gradually, the focus of the journal expanded. Alongside the notes about weather began to appear brief descriptions of movement below. A group of 3 passed along the eastern trail at midday. A lone hiker paused near the river at sunset. 2 figures turned back early because of wind. The language remained simple and detached, but the intent was unmistakable. The writers were not only surviving here, they were paying attention to the world beneath them with quiet discipline. He imagined the scene as it must have unfolded year after year. Someone standing at the small window with a pair of tired eyes, looking down at tiny figures crawling through the vast landscape, making careful marks on paper while storms rolled across the peaks. It felt almost like the work of unseen guardians, though the journal itself never used such romantic words. Further into the book, he found the first direct references to action. A short line mentioned leaving a mark on a dangerous section of path after noticing an inexperienced traveler heading that way. Another entry described moving a loose stone that might have caused a fall. These were small acts, barely worth a sentence, yet they revealed a significant change. Observation had slowly turned into quiet intervention. The more he read, the more he understood the discipline behind those actions. The journal never bragged. It never claimed heroism. It simply recorded what had been done, as if the act of helping others was as ordinary as noting the temperature. Whoever lived here had helped without expectation of thanks or recognition. They had helped because they believed someone needed to. Names began to appear more often as the years passed. Sometimes only a first name, sometimes a full description detailed enough to recognize a person on sight. He read about families with heavy packs, about couples arguing on steep climbs, about solo travelers who moved too fast for their own safety. Each entry was calm, measured, and strangely compassionate. The writers did not judge the people below. They simply watched them with the careful attention of those who understood how quickly a small mistake could become a tragedy. Then he reached the pages that had unsettled him earlier, the pages where the tone shifted. Among the neat observations appeared brief, painful lines. A name followed by the simple phrase, "did not return." Another name marked the same way. The first time he had seen those words, they had shocked him. Now, reading them in context, they felt even heavier. He tried to imagine what it must have been like to watch a person disappear into danger and be powerless to change the outcome. To see someone struggle through a storm or vanish behind a ridge and never emerge again. The journal made it clear that these moments had stayed with the writers long after the ink had dried. The calm handwriting could not fully hide the sorrow behind it. Some entries were more detailed. One described a sudden avalanche that swept across a common route. Another mentioned a hiker who ignored clear warnings of weather and continued upward despite obvious signs of trouble. The journal never used emotional language, yet the facts themselves carried enough weight. These people had witnessed more than beautiful views from their high ledge. They had witnessed loss. He paused often while reading, letting the silence of the cabin fill the space between paragraphs. Outside the window, the sky had begun to glow with the soft colors of evening, but he barely noticed. The pages held him with a quiet intensity that felt almost like conversation with someone long gone. As he moved deeper into the book, he noticed subtle changes in the handwriting. At certain points, the letters grew slightly different, suggesting that more than one person had contributed. The journal had been a shared responsibility, passed from hand to hand like a torch. That realization strengthened his sense that this place had once been home to a small community rather than a single lonely figure. There were hints of internal life as well, brief references to sickness, to difficult winters, to arguments resolved in a few careful lines. Nothing was explained directly, yet he could feel the human drama hiding between the rows of dates and weather reports. These people had lived close together under extreme conditions. Their lives must have been shaped by pressures most ordinary travelers would never understand. Occasionally, the journal mentioned decisions made as a group, a new path marked, a supply hidden near a dangerous crossing, a choice to avoid contact with certain visitors. The writers seemed determined to remain unseen, helping only from a distance. He wondered why they had chosen such secrecy. Fear of discovery? Fear of being forced to leave? The book offered no easy answers. One particular entry caught his attention and stayed with him long after he turned the page. It described a young man who had become lost during a sudden storm. The riders had watched him struggle for hours from their hidden vantage point. They had placed markers along a safer route and waited anxiously through the night. In the morning, they recorded simply that he had found his way down and disappeared into the valley, unaware that invisible hands had guided him home. Reading that story, he felt a strange mixture of admiration and sadness. The people who lived here had saved lives without ever being known. They had accepted anonymity as part of their duty. In a world obsessed with recognition, their quiet dedication seemed almost unreal. The journal also revealed how carefully they protected themselves. There were repeated notes about avoiding direct contact, about erasing signs of their presence, about keeping fires small and hidden. They feared being discovered, yet they continued to help. It was a delicate balance, and he sensed how exhausting it must have been to maintain. As night approached, he found himself reading faster, eager to absorb as much as possible before darkness forced him to stop. The later pages grew more serious. The number of entries marked with loss increased. Weather seemed harsher, winters longer. The handwriting occasionally trembled, hinting at fatigue or age. The community that had once been strong appeared to shrink slowly over time. In several places, the journal referred to internal tragedies. One member injured beyond the ability of simple medicine, another forced to leave and never return. The group that had begun as several voices gradually became fewer and fewer. By the final years, it seemed that only one or two writers remained to carry the burden of watching. The emotional weight of those final pages pressed on him with surprising force. He had come here as a stranger seeking adventure. Now, he felt as though he were reading the last testament of people he had begun to know through their careful words. Their courage was quiet and uncelebrated, yet it shone clearly through every line. Near the end of the book, he encountered the entry that had first drawn his attention earlier in the day, the brief description that matched his own appearance and route. Seeing it again in full context unsettled him deeply. At some point in the past, someone standing exactly where he now sat had watched a man like him climbing these cliffs and had recorded his presence with the same calm detachment used for everyone else. The thought made the cabin feel suddenly smaller, more intimate. He was no longer just a reader. In a strange way, he had become part of the story, connected to these unseen watchers across an unknown stretch of time. The final pages were the hardest to read. The handwriting grew thinner, more hesitant. Entries became shorter, sometimes only a few lines long. There were mentions of failing health and dwindling supplies, yet even in those difficult moments, the writers continued to record the movement of travelers below. Their commitment never wavered, even as their own strength faded. The last dated entry described a successful effort to guide a group away from a dangerous section of trail. After that, the pages went blank, leaving only empty lines waiting for words that never came. He stared at that silence for a long time, feeling the weight of an unfinished story settle around him. Closing the journal gently, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. The room had grown dim, and he realized how long he had been sitting there. The book lay on the table like a living thing, filled with years of patience, fear, and quiet kindness. It was more than a record. It was a monument to people who had chosen to care for strangers while remaining hidden from the world. He understood now that the cabins were not simply shelters. They were the physical expression of a mission carried out far from public praise. The tools in the workshop, the careful living space, the hidden vantage points all served one purpose: to watch, to help, to endure. The moral weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. He had arrived here by chance, but chance had placed him in possession of something important. If he walked away and forgot what he had seen, these people would vanish completely, leaving no trace except fragile wood on a lonely ledge. Yet, if he revealed everything, he risked turning their quiet lives into a spectacle they had never wanted. For the first time, he felt a genuine sense of responsibility. The journal was not his property, yet he was now its guardian. Whatever decision he made in the coming days would shape the memory of those who had lived and died here. He stood and looked out the window at the darkening sky. Far below, the last traces of daylight touched the valley where unaware travelers prepared for evening. None of them knew that above their heads, hidden among cliffs, a small group of unknown people had once dedicated their lives to keeping others safe. Returning the journal carefully to its compartment, he replaced the board exactly as he had found it. The cabin fell back into its quiet disguise, holding its secrets once more. But he knew that the knowledge he had gained would follow him long after he left this place. As he prepared to spend the night on the ledge before descending in the morning, he understood that his journey had changed direction. He had come seeking solitude and challenge. He had found instead a legacy of unseen courage. And the question of what to do with that legacy would shape every step he took from this moment forward. The night he spent on the ledge passed in uneasy fragments of sleep, broken by wind and the unfamiliar creaks of old wood. He had chosen to remain in the first cabin, telling himself it was the most practical decision. Descending in darkness would have been dangerous, and staying allowed him to think. Yet, practical reasoning only partly explained why he had not left. Something in the journal had anchored him here, holding him to this narrow shelf of stone as firmly as any rope. By morning, the sky had cleared, washed pale and cold. The valley below lay calm and distant, and for a brief moment he felt almost as though the discoveries of the previous day had been a strange dream. But the cabins remained exactly as they were, stubborn and silent, and the memory of the pages he had read returned with full weight. He knew he could not simply shoulder his pack and continue with his planned route as if nothing had happened. Sitting on the step outside with a cup of water in his hands, he tried to reconstruct the story that lay scattered between the lines of the journal. The pieces were there, though never stated directly. These people had not come to the mountains for adventure. They had come to disappear. He began to see how the pattern fit together. The journal spoke of caution, secrecy, and careful avoidance of contact. The cabins were built in a place almost impossible to reach without skill and determination. Supplies were minimal, luxuries non-existent. Everything pointed to a life chosen not for comfort, but for necessity. Whoever had lived here had needed to be invisible. The word fugitives had hovered at the edge of his thoughts since the first night, but now it settled more firmly. Not fugitives in the dramatic sense of criminals on the run, but people fleeing something quieter and more complicated. False accusations, threats they could not escape. Situations where returning to ordinary life had become impossible. The journal never used such language, yet the evidence was undeniable. He imagined them arriving, one by one, perhaps at different times, each carrying a personal history too heavy to bear openly. The mountains offered what the world below could not: distance, anonymity, a chance to begin again without questions. High above the common roots, they had built a fragile sanctuary where past identities could be set aside. The more he considered it, the more he understood why they had chosen this specific ledge. From here, they could watch the main trails without being seen. They could remain aware of human movement while avoiding direct contact. The place allowed them to stay connected to the world just enough to survive, yet far enough to remain safe from it. It was not a random refuge. It was a carefully selected hiding place. The journal hinted at their reasons without ever revealing them openly. Occasional lines mentioned searches below, or questions asked in the valley. There were references to avoiding certain uniforms and to changing routines when strangers lingered too long. These were not the notes of people hiding from justice. They were the notes of people hiding from something more personal and more frightening. He wondered what kinds of stories had driven them here. Perhaps one had been wrongly blamed for a crime. Another might have escaped an abusive past. Someone else could have been running from debts or from threats that no authority would take seriously. In the world below, such problems often had no easy solutions. In the mountains, at least, there was silence. Yet the journal also made it clear that they had not turned their backs on humanity entirely. Instead of withdrawing into bitterness, they had chosen to watch over others from a distance. That choice fascinated him more than anything else. People who were hiding, who feared discovery, had still decided to help strangers they would never meet. As he reviewed the pages in his mind, he saw how gradually that decision must have formed. At first, they had likely watched simply out of habit, curious about the tiny figures moving through the valley. Over time, observation turned into concern. Concern turned into small actions. A stone moved here, a warning left there. The need to remain unseen had shaped the way they helped, forcing them to become invisible guardians rather than open rescuers. He walked slowly along the ledge, studying the cabins again with new understanding. Every detail now carried additional meaning. The reinforced doors were not only for weather, but for security. The hidden compartment for the journal existed so that no casual visitor would ever learn their secrets. Even the careful arrangement of supplies suggested people who could not risk attracting attention by frequent trips to towns below. The idea of how they survived fascinated him. Living at this altitude required constant effort. Food would have been scarce and difficult to transport. Fuel for the stoves must have been gathered from far below and carried up narrow, dangerous paths. Medical care would have been almost non-existent. Yet they had endured for years, perhaps decades, creating a life balanced delicately between isolation and purpose. He pictured them making cautious descents under cover of darkness or bad weather, gathering what they needed from remote villages without leaving traces of their true home. They would have learned to blend into the background, to appear as ordinary travelers passing through, while always returning to this hidden shelf of rock where their real lives waited. The journal suggested that they had developed their own rules over time. Never speak to tourists directly. Never reveal the existence of the cabins. Help only when necessary, and only in ways that could not be traced. These rules must have been discussed and refined through long conversations around the small stove, shaped by fear and experience. Breaking them could have meant losing everything. He tried to imagine the psychological weight of such a life. To live constantly on guard, always watching for signs of discovery, always measuring each action against the risk of exposure. It would have required remarkable discipline and trust among them. The cabins, simple as they were, represented not only shelter, but a shared commitment to survive together. Yet the journal also hinted at tension. Small phrases suggested disagreements about how far to go in helping others, about whether to reveal themselves in emergencies, about whether remaining hidden was still worth the cost. These were not saints carved from stone. They were ordinary people struggling with impossible choices. The thought softened his earlier impression of them as distant observers. They had been human, flawed and uncertain, bound together by circumstance rather than idealism. Their decision to help others had grown slowly out of their own vulnerability. Perhaps seeing strangers in danger reminded them too sharply of their own fragile positions. He sat again at the edge of the ledge, legs dangling over the open air, and considered how easy it would have been for them to choose differently. They could have ignored the world entirely, focusing only on their own survival. No one would have blamed them. Instead, they had accepted an additional burden, risking everything to protect people who would never know their names. That choice revealed something profound about them. Whatever they had been before arriving here, whatever mistakes or tragedies had shaped their pasts, they had not allowed those experiences to harden into cruelty. Isolation had not turned them inward. Instead, it had sharpened their sense of responsibility. He wondered how many lives had been quietly touched by their presence. The journal recorded only a fraction of the interventions, yet even those few examples suggested dozens of people guided away from danger without ever realizing it. Somewhere in the world below, there were men and women who had returned home safely because unseen hands had helped them at critical moments. The idea filled him with both admiration and sadness. Admiration for the courage it took to live this way. Sadness because such courage would likely never be recognized. These people had chosen to disappear, and in doing so, they had ensured that their good deeds would vanish with them. As the morning warmed slightly, he walked to the workshop cabin and examined the tools again, imagining them in use. He could almost see a figure bent over the bench, repairing a broken boot sole or mending torn fabric, preparing for another difficult season. The physical labor required to maintain this place must have been immense, yet they had accepted it without complaint. The third cabin, with its 2 narrow beds, seemed especially poignant now. He pictured conversations whispered late at night, plans made for the next day, worries shared in low voices so that the mountain itself might not overhear. These rooms had once held real laughter, real fear, real companionship. Now they held only silence. He tried to understand why they had not sought help from official channels. Why not join a rescue service openly, or report dangers to authorities? The answer lay scattered throughout the journal. Fear, distrust, the knowledge that exposure could unravel whatever fragile safety they had built. For them, anonymity had been the highest form of protection. The tragedy of that choice weighed on him. By remaining hidden, they had denied themselves the support and resources that might have saved them in later years. Illness, injury, and age had slowly worn them down. The journal's final pages made it clear that their dedication had come at a terrible personal cost. Yet, even as their numbers dwindled, they had continued to watch and to help. That stubborn perseverance moved him more deeply than any dramatic tale of heroism could have. These were not legends. They were ordinary people who had refused to stop caring. He began to understand that the story of the cabins was not merely about fugitives hiding from the world. It was about what people chose to do with their lives after being pushed to the margins. Instead of becoming bitter or dangerous, they had turned outward, creating a quiet legacy that no one would ever celebrate. Standing once more at the window of the first cabin, he looked down at the familiar trail far below. Hikers were already moving along it, bright specks against the green and gray landscape. None of them knew how close they were to the remnants of that hidden history. None of them suspected that above them lay evidence of years of unseen kindness. He felt suddenly protective of the place, as if it were not merely an abandoned site but a fragile memorial. Revealing it thoughtlessly would invite curiosity seekers and treasure hunters, people who would treat the cabins as a spectacle rather than a testament. Keeping it secret, however, would mean allowing the memory of those who lived here to fade completely. The dilemma settled over him with increasing weight. He had come here by accident, yet accident had placed a responsibility in his hands. The fugitives of the journal had spent their lives balancing secrecy and compassion. Now he faced a similar balance, though in a different form. He returned to the first cabin and looked again at the hidden compartment where the journal rested. That book was the only true witness to their existence. Without it, the cabins would be nothing more than mysterious ruins on a cliff. With it, they became part of a larger human story, one that deserved to be treated with respect. As he considered his next steps, he realized how deeply the place had already changed him. Only 2 days earlier, he had been a solitary hiker seeking personal challenge. Now, he found himself thinking about strangers he would never meet, feeling connected to them through the fragile thread of ink on paper. The fugitives who had built this refuge were gone, their names unrecorded, their reasons only guessed at, but the choices they had made had continued to echo. Their decision to help others despite their own fear had reached across time to touch him directly. He stood in the doorway, looking out across the vast emptiness, and understood that leaving would not be as simple as walking away. The mountains had given him more than a view and a difficult route. They had given him a story that demanded care. And, as the wind moved softly through the aging boards, he knew that whatever he chose to do next would shape the final chapter of the lives lived here, high above the world that had once forced them to flee. The more time he spent on the ledge, the more clearly he understood that the true purpose of the cabins had never been survival alone. Survival had been the foundation, the necessity, the unavoidable condition of being here. But what gave this place meaning was something gentler and more complicated. The journal had revealed it slowly, line by line, entry by entry. These people had not only hidden from the world, they had watched over it. He woke that morning with the realization already waiting for him, as solid as the cliff beneath his feet. The fugitives, whoever they had been before coming here, had transformed themselves into silent caretakers of the mountains. Their help had not been dramatic. There were no rescues performed in the open, no heroic confrontations with storms, no grand gestures. Instead, there had been hundreds of small, careful interventions so subtle that the people they saved would never know they had been saved at all. Sitting once more at the small table with the journal open before him, he began to read the middle years of the record with new attention. These were the pages where observation had fully turned into action. The early sections had only hinted at concern. Here, concern became habit. One entry described a pair of inexperienced hikers who had taken a wrong turn near a steep ridge. The writer had noted their confusion from above and had later left a simple marker, nothing more than a few rearranged stones, guiding them back toward a safer path. Another entry spoke of a group caught by early snow, their pace slowing dangerously as daylight faded. The fugitives had carried extra water and food down to the sheltered spot where the group would naturally find it, leaving no trace of who had placed it there. Reading those accounts, he began to see how carefully the system worked. Every act of help was designed to appear accidental or natural. A stick laid across a dangerous trail at just the right angle. A piece of cloth tied to a branch where visibility was poor. A loose rock quietly removed before it could cause a fall. The fugitives helped without ever stepping out of the shadows. He tried to imagine the patience such work required, to spend long hours watching strangers through a narrow window, to notice their mistakes, to calculate whether intervention was necessary, and then to act in ways that would not reveal their existence. It was a form of guardianship stripped of pride. There would be no thanks, no recognition, not even the comfort of seeing gratitude on a rescued face. The journal recorded these actions with the same calm tone used for weather reports. Left sign near Eastern Pass. Moved hazard after storm. Placed water at usual point. Simple sentences that carried extraordinary weight. Each one represented a decision to risk exposure for the sake of someone unknown. He found himself slowing down as he read, pausing after each entry to imagine the scene. A storm rolling in unexpectedly, clouds swallowing the peaks while a lone traveler struggles below. One of the fugitives leaving the warmth of the cabin, pulling on worn boots, stepping carefully along the ledge to place a discreet marker that might mean the difference between life and death. Then returning silently, erasing every footprint, allowing the saved person to believe they had simply been lucky. There was a humility in that process that touched him deeply. In the modern world, help was often loud. People helped in ways that could be photographed, posted, and praised. These unknown watchers had done the opposite. They had helped in ways that erased themselves completely. The journal contained dozens of such stories. Some were minor. A warning scratched into dirt, a safer route subtly emphasized, a fallen tree moved aside. Others carried more tension. In one entry, the writer described guiding a lost hiker through heavy fog, using nothing more than carefully placed stones and pieces of fabric. Another told of dragging a half-frozen man's pack to a spot where he would find it easily after wandering in circles. He realized that the fugitives must have studied the behavior of travelers closely. They understood how tired people thought, how fear affected decisions, how easily panic could take over in the wrong conditions. Their help was never random. It was precise, calculated, and deeply informed by years of watching. There were moments in the journal where the writers admitted their own uncertainty. Should we intervene or wait? Will this be noticed? Are we risking too much? These brief doubts made the entries feel even more human. Helping from the shadows had not always been easy. Every choice had carried consequences. As the years progressed, the system grew more sophisticated. The fugitives developed unofficial stations along dangerous sections, small caches of supplies hidden in places only they knew. They created a network of signs that could be adjusted according to weather and season. The cabins had become the command center of an invisible rescue service. He began to see how much discipline this required. They had to watch constantly without becoming complacent. They had to resist the urge to intervene too openly, even when situations looked dire. Above all, they had to remain unseen, because discovery would have destroyed everything they had built. The moral complexity of their lives fascinated him. These were people who had fled society for their own reasons, yet they had not abandoned social responsibility. In a strange way, they had created a new form of community, one that existed only through acts of kindness rather than conversation. He turned a page and found an entry that struck him more strongly than the rest. It described a young woman traveling alone who had become trapped on a narrow ledge after choosing a risky shortcut. The fugitives had watched her struggle for hours as the sun dropped lower. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, one of them had descended part way and left a rope where she could reach it. The woman had used it to escape and had gone on her way, never knowing that a hidden stranger had waited nearby in case she slipped again. The entry ended with a simple sentence: "We did not sleep that night." Reading those words, he felt the distance between himself and the unknown writers shrink. These were not cold observers. They cared deeply, sometimes painfully, about the people they helped. Their secrecy did not protect them from worry. The journal also revealed how dangerous their work could be. Several entries mentioned close calls, moments when someone nearly spotted them or when weather had trapped them outside longer than planned. Helping others from the shadows required stepping into risk again and again, with no safety net except their own experience. One winter section told of a massive storm that had cut off normal routes for weeks. During that time, the fugitives had worked almost constantly, leaving signs and supplies for desperate travelers while struggling to keep themselves alive. The writer described exhaustion, frozen fingers, and the fear of being discovered by rescue teams searching the area. Yet, even in those harsh conditions, they had continued to help. He wondered how many lives had been quietly altered by such efforts. Perhaps there were people walking the world right now who would never know that an invisible hand had guided them to safety. The thought filled him with a quiet sense of awe. As he read deeper into the later years, he noticed how the tone of the entries slowly changed. The number of helpers had decreased, and the burden on those remaining had grown heavier. What had once been a shared mission became the responsibility of fewer and fewer shoulders. Yet the actions continued. Even as age and hardship took their toll, the commitment remained. There was a particular poignancy in the descriptions of simple gestures. A note about repairing a broken signpost that no one would connect to them. A record of placing fresh water where a dehydrated hiker might find it. These were small kindnesses, almost invisible in the larger world, but here they formed the heart of the story. He realized that the fugitives had created their own code of ethics. Help, but do not reveal yourself. Save lives, but do not seek gratitude. Remain unseen, but never indifferent. It was a difficult balance, one that required constant vigilance and self-control. The more he absorbed, the more he felt humbled by their dedication. He had always considered himself a careful and responsible hiker, but compared to these unknown guardians, his efforts seemed modest. They had turned the act of watching into an art, and the act of helping into a quiet discipline. At times, the journal hinted at moments when they wished they could do more. There were entries describing situations beyond their ability to influence. Storms too fierce, accidents too sudden. Those pages carried a sense of helplessness that weighed on him as a reader. Even with all their effort, they could not save everyone. Yet, they never stopped trying. He closed the book for a moment and stepped outside to clear his thoughts. The day had grown bright, the sky sharp and blue. Far below, a new group of hikers moved along the familiar trail, unaware that they were once again passing beneath the gaze of history. He felt an almost protective instinct toward them, as if he had inherited, at least temporarily, the role once held by the fugitives. Standing there, he understood that the quiet help described in the journal was more than a series of good deeds. It was a way of reclaiming humanity after being forced to live apart from it. By helping strangers, the fugitives had kept themselves connected to the world they had left behind. Their kindness had been a form of survival as essential as food or shelter. Returning to the cabin, he continued reading until the light began to fade again. The later pages grew more sparse, yet the pattern remained. Watch, decide, act carefully, leave no trace. It was a rhythm repeated over years until it became the natural order of their lives. When he finally set the journal aside, he felt as though he had spent the day in the company of invisible mentors. They had taught him, through their quiet example, what it meant to care without reward. Their help had been ordinary in method, but extraordinary in spirit. The realization brought with it a new understanding of his own position. By discovering this place, he had become the only living witness to their work. The responsibility that came with that knowledge pressed on him more strongly than ever. He could not undo what he had learned. He could only decide how to honor it. As evening settled over the ledge, he watched the shadows lengthen and thought about the people whose footsteps had once crossed this same stone. Their names were lost, their faces unknown, yet their actions had left a mark deeper than any carving. The quiet help they had offered from this impossible place continued to echo through the mountains. And now, whether he liked it or not, that echo had reached him. By the time he reached the later sections of the journal, the weight of the story had begun to feel almost physical. What had started as a careful record of weather and movement had slowly turned into something heavier, something burdened with years of responsibility. The quiet help described in earlier chapters of the book had been steady and hopeful, but as he read deeper, hope gradually gave way to endurance, and endurance to exhaustion. The pattern of the entries changed almost imperceptibly at first. He noticed it only because he had become so familiar with the rhythm of the writing. Where earlier pages were full and confident, later ones grew shorter. Sentences that once stretched across several lines were reduced to fragments. Observations became more practical, more urgent, as if there was no longer enough time or energy for detail. The first true sign of tragedy appeared without warning. It was only a single line, written at the end of a page in slightly different handwriting, a name he had seen before, followed by the stark, uncompromising words, "Did not return." There was no explanation, no description of what had happened, no attempt to soften the blow. Just a fact, recorded in the same calm tone as a note about wind direction. Yet the simplicity of it struck him harder than any dramatic account could have. He read the line several times, hoping to find something he had missed. But there was nothing more. The next entry returned to routine observations, as if the world had continued without pause. Still, he could feel the emotional weight hidden behind that silence. For the first time, the watchers had become the ones being watched by fate. As he moved forward through the journal, the entries began to reveal fragments of what had happened. The lost member of their small group had gone out during a storm to leave a warning sign for a pair of inexperienced hikers. The storm had worsened unexpectedly, and he had not made it back to the cabins. The following pages spoke of searching from a distance, of hoping for days, of finally accepting what the mountains had taken. The writer never used dramatic language. There were no expressions of grief, no personal reflections. Yet the absence of emotion made the loss feel even deeper. It was as if the survivors had forced themselves to remain calm because calm was the only way to continue. After that first death, the tone of the journal changed permanently. The entries grew more cautious. Interventions were weighed more carefully. Risks were measured with greater hesitation. But the helping did not stop. If anything, it became more deliberate, as though the remaining fugitives felt obligated to continue the work their lost companion had begun. He imagined how that loss must have echoed through the small cabins. One less voice at the table. One less pair of hands to carry supplies or repair broken tools. In a place so isolated, every absence would have been magnified 100 times. The ledge that had once sheltered a fragile community must have felt suddenly emptier, colder, more dangerous. Months passed in the pages. The seasons turned as they always had, yet something fundamental had shifted. The journal mentioned illness more often. Injuries that once would have been minor began to linger. There were notes about aching joints, about weakness, about the difficulty of simple tasks that had once been routine. Another name appeared with the same cruel phrase: did not return. This time there was slightly more detail. The second loss had not come from a rescue attempt, but from the slow wearing down of years. A fall on icy stone, a broken bone that could not be properly treated, an infection that the small medical supplies could not cure. In the world below, help would have been available. Here, high above everything, there had been no one to call. The entry ended with a single word written heavily at the bottom of the page: confirmed. He closed his eyes for a moment after reading that, trying to imagine the loneliness of the person who had written it. To lose a companion in such a place, to be forced to continue living in the same small room where their presence still lingered, must have been a kind of slow torment. Yet the journal showed no surrender. Even as their numbers dwindled, the fugitives continued to watch and to help. It was as if the mission itself had become stronger than the people carrying it. Perhaps continuing the work was the only way they knew how to honor those who were gone. The entries grew fewer and more scattered. There were longer gaps between dates, suggesting that fewer hands were available to keep the record. Sometimes an entire week would pass with only a single short note. The energy that had once filled every page was fading. He felt as though he were witnessing the gradual dimming of a light that had burned brightly for years. One section described a particularly harsh winter when storms arrived earlier than expected. Supplies ran low. The writer spoke of rationing food and fuel, of sleeping in shifts to keep the stove burning, of watching helplessly as travelers below took risks they could no longer safely counter. The sense of helplessness in those lines was almost unbearable. There were moments when they considered revealing themselves, asking for official help, ending their hidden lives. But each time, fear or pride or caution held them back. They had built their existence around secrecy for so long that stepping into the open must have felt impossible. Another entry told of a desperate rescue attempt that had nearly cost the life of one of the remaining fugitives. A hiker had become trapped on a narrow ledge, unable to move forward or back. The watcher had descended at night to leave a rope and guide the man to safety. The rescue succeeded, but the helper returned with frostbitten hands and a lingering injury that never fully healed. Reading that passage, he felt a deep respect mixed with sorrow. These people had continued to give even when they had almost nothing left. Eventually, the journal reached a point where only one handwriting remained. The community that had once filled the cabins with quiet companionship had been reduced to a single survivor. The later pages carried a loneliness so strong that it seemed to rise from the paper itself. The last writer tried to maintain the routine. Weather, movement, occasional interventions, but the effort clearly grew harder with each passing season. There were mentions of failing eyesight, of pain that made climbing difficult, of nights when sleep would not come. He wondered what it must have felt like to sit alone at that small table, listening to the wind outside, knowing that the work could not continue forever. The final tragedy unfolded slowly over many entries rather than in a single dramatic moment. The last fugitive grew weaker. Tasks that once took an hour required an entire day. The journal described attempts to prepare the cabins for abandonment, as if the writer understood that the end was approaching. Yet even then, the helping did not stop. One of the last detailed entries spoke of guiding a group away from a dangerous avalanche zone during an unexpected thaw. The writer admitted exhaustion, but expressed relief that the travelers had passed safely. It was an act of kindness carried out at the very edge of human endurance. After that, the pages became nearly blank. Short notes appeared sporadically, sometimes only a date with no additional information. The once precise record faded into silence. He reached the final written page with a sense of dread. The handwriting there was shaky, but still careful. The entry described watching a lone hiker pass safely through a difficult section. It ended with a simple statement that felt like both a farewell and a confession. If we disappear, no one will know. There were no more words after that. He sat for a long time with the journal open to that last page, feeling as though he had reached the end of a long vigil. The story did not end with heroics or resolution. It ended with quiet acceptance, with the recognition that a lifetime of unseen work might vanish without a trace. The tragedy of it struck him more deeply than any tale of sudden death could have. These people had not only lost their lives in the mountains, they had lost their chance to be remembered. Their sacrifices, their fears, their countless acts of kindness had all been carried out in deliberate obscurity. He imagined the final survivor sitting alone in the cabin, knowing that soon even the journal would remain unread, hidden behind its board. Perhaps they had hoped that someday someone like him would stumble upon it, or perhaps they had accepted that the world would move on without ever knowing what had happened here. The thought filled him with a quiet determination. Whatever else he chose to do, he could not allow their story to disappear completely. To ignore what he had learned would be to let their tragedy deepen. He closed the book gently and looked around the small room, seeing it now not as an abandoned shelter, but as a witness to years of courage and loss. The walls had held the voices of people who had chosen to help others even as their own lives unraveled. The stove had warmed hands that saved strangers. The narrow window had framed countless anxious watches over the valley below. Outside, the wind moved through the aging boards with a soft, mournful sound. The mountains remained indifferent, as they always did, to the dramas played out upon them. But he was not indifferent. He had been given a glimpse into a hidden chapter of human resilience, and he felt changed by it. Standing at the edge of the ledge once more, he looked down at the familiar trail winding through the distance. Somewhere along that path walked people who owed their lives to those now-gone watchers. They would never know it. But he knew. The tragedy recorded in the journal was not only the loss of individuals, it was the loss of memory, the near erasure of a remarkable story. And that, he realized, was something he might still be able to prevent. As the sun dipped lower and the shadows lengthened, he understood that the final chapter of this place had not yet been written. The fugitives had done what they could in their time. Now, the responsibility, in some small way, had passed to him. He closed the door of the cabin gently behind him, carrying with him not just the weight of sorrow, but the fragile beginnings of a decision. The journal lay closed on the table in front of him, its worn cover reflecting the pale morning light that slipped through the small window. He had spent most of the previous day reading and rereading the final pages, absorbing the full shape of the story they contained. Now, with the weight of it settled deeply inside him, he understood that he could no longer pretend to be only a visitor passing through. What he had found on this ledge was not merely an abandoned shelter or a curiosity hidden high in the mountains. It was a record of human lives, of choices made quietly and bravely, of kindness offered without witnesses. And with that discovery came a responsibility he had never expected to carry. He sat for a long time without moving, listening to the familiar sounds of wind sliding along the cliff face. The mountains around him remained vast and indifferent, just as they had been for centuries. But his own world had shifted. The simple plan he had brought with him on this hike no longer mattered. The route he had intended to follow, the schedule he had carefully prepared, all felt strangely unimportant beside the question now facing him. What should be done with the story of the fugitives? The most obvious answer was also the easiest. Take the journal down to the valley, hand it over to authorities or historians, and allow the world to learn what had happened here. Such a discovery would certainly draw attention. Reporters would come, researchers would analyze the pages. The cabins would become a destination for curious visitors. The unknown guardians of the mountains would finally be recognized. Yet, the more he imagined that outcome, the more uncomfortable it made him feel. The fugitives had lived and helped in secrecy by choice. They had structured their entire existence around remaining unseen. To drag their private records into the open world now felt almost like a betrayal. The journal was not meant for publicity. It was meant to guide quiet actions and to preserve memory within a small circle that no longer existed. He stood and walked to the doorway, looking out over the vast drop to the valley below. The morning was clear, and he could already see a few early hikers making their way along the distant trail. Ordinary people enjoying an ordinary day, unaware that above them lay the remains of a hidden history. Part of him wanted to protect that innocence, to keep the cabins from becoming another crowded attraction stripped of meaning. At the same time, he knew that doing nothing carried its own dangers. If he simply left the place untouched and told no one, time would continue its slow work. The cabins would eventually collapse. The journal would decay beyond reading. Everything he had learned would fade into silence. The fugitives would disappear completely, just as the final writer had feared. Neither extreme seemed right. He returned to the table and opened the journal again, turning the pages with a gentler hand now, as though handling something fragile and alive. He realized that his dilemma was not so different from the one the fugitives themselves had faced for years. They too had balanced secrecy against responsibility, choosing their actions carefully to avoid causing harm. Perhaps, he thought, the answer lay somewhere in that same balance. He began to consider alternatives. Maybe the story could be preserved without exposing the exact location. The names and details from the journal could be shared in a way that honored the spirit of the people who had written it, while keeping the cabins themselves safe from intrusion. Memory did not require turning a quiet place into a spectacle. The idea settled in his mind slowly, gaining strength. He could document what he had found, transcribe the important sections, photograph certain pages, and then return everything to its hidden place. In that way, the knowledge would survive even if the physical structures did not. The fugitives would be remembered without losing the privacy they had guarded so carefully. But even that solution raised questions. Who should he trust with such information? How could he ensure that others would treat it with the same respect he felt now? Once released, stories had a way of escaping control. He rubbed his temples, feeling the complexity of the problem pressing against him. He had not asked to become the caretaker of someone else's legacy, yet chance had placed him in that role. The mountains had given him a choice, and choices in places like this were never simple. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the loose boards of the cabin, reminding him of the fragile nature of everything around him. Nothing here would last forever. If he walked away without making a decision, the decision would be made by time and weather instead. He thought again about the people whose lives filled the journal. They had not been perfect. They had made mistakes, argued, suffered, and eventually faded away. But they had also done something rare and beautiful. They had cared for strangers in a world that often ignored such kindness. Surely that deserved to be remembered. He realized then that the heart of his dilemma was not really about the cabins at all. It was about the values they represented. If he could carry those values forward without violating the fugitive's wishes, he would be honoring them more truly than any monument or news article ever could. The idea of quiet continuation began to take shape in his thoughts. What if he did more than simply preserve their story? What if he also preserved their purpose? He imagined returning here in future seasons, not as a curious visitor, but as someone quietly maintaining what they had built. A few repaired markers along the lower trails. A discreet cache of emergency supplies placed where they might help someone in need. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, just small acts in the same spirit as those recorded in the journal. At first, the thought felt presumptuous. Who was he to step into a role that others had filled for decades? Yet, the more he considered it, the more natural it seemed. He had the skills. He had the respect for the mountains. And now, he had the knowledge. Perhaps the greatest tribute he could offer was not to reveal the past, but to extend it. He stood and walked slowly through the cabins again, this time seeing them not as relics, but as tools waiting for use. The workshop with its simple equipment. The living space with its quiet sense of order. The observation cabin with its narrow window looking down on the trails. All of it still capable of serving the same purpose it had once served. Of course, he would not live here as they had. His life belonged elsewhere. But he could visit quietly and respectfully and ensures that the spirit of their work did not die completely. The more he considered this path, the more at peace he felt. He returned to the table and began to plan practically, the way he always planned in the mountains. First, he would make careful notes from the journal, enough to preserve the essential story without removing the book from its home. He would photograph selected pages as a safeguard, keeping them private for now. Then he would restore everything exactly as he had found it. Before leaving, he would strengthen a few of the discreet trail markers he had noticed on his ascent, just enough to reduce the risk of accidents without creating anything obvious. And in the future, he would return when he could, quietly continuing the tradition of unseen help. It was not a perfect solution. No solution could be. But it felt honest. As the day unfolded, he worked slowly and methodically. He copied important passages into his own notebook, careful to capture the tone as well as the facts. He sketched rough diagrams of the ledge and the surrounding routes, not to share publicly, but to guide his own future efforts. Throughout the process, he felt a growing sense of connection to the unknown riders, as if he were joining a conversation that had begun long before his arrival. By afternoon, the practical tasks were complete. The journal rested once more in its hidden compartment. The cabins stood as they always had, silent and watchful. Nothing about the place looked any different, yet everything had changed. He packed his belongings carefully, leaving no trace of his presence beyond a few small repairs that would never be noticed by casual eyes. At the doorway, he paused and looked around one last time, committing the scene to memory. The fugitives had feared that their work would vanish without witness. Because of him, that fear would not come true. Their names might remain unknown, but their actions would not. Stepping out onto the ledge, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The descent ahead would be long and careful, just like any mountain journey, but when he reached the valley and returned to ordinary life, he would carry something new within him. The story of hidden kindness, the example of courage without applause, the reminder that real heroism often leaves no signature. As he began the slow climb down toward familiar ground, he understood that his relationship with these mountains had changed forever. He would return, not seeking adventure, but seeking to continue a small, unseen tradition that mattered more than any summit. High above him, the old cabins watched in silence, holding their secrets with patience. And somewhere within their weathered walls a simple journal waited, no longer alone. If this story made you stop and think, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Hit the like button if you want more videos like this, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And write in the comments where you're watching from. I read every message. Stay with us, because the next discovery is closer than you think.